I'm going to read a bit from early in the book, which is in part about my father, from whom I learned a lot. And one of the things I learned from him was interest in the origin story of Islam. And then I'm going to read a bit about the origin story of Islam, just so you know where it all came from. My father's name was Anis Ahmad Rushdie. Anis was a godless man, still a shocking statement to make in the United States, though an unexceptional one in Europe, and an incomprehensible idea in much of the rest of the world where the thought of not believing is hard even to formulate. But that was what he was, a godless man who knew and thought a great deal about God. The birth of Islam fascinated him because it was the only one of the great world religions to be born within recorded history, whose prophet was not a legend described and glorified by evangelists writing 100 years or more after the real man lived and died, or a dish recooked for easy global consumption by the brilliant proselytizer St. Paul, but rather a man whose life was largely on the record, whose social and economic circumstances were well known, a man living in a time of profound social change, an orphan who grew up to be a successful merchant with mystical tendencies, and who saw one day on Mount Hira near Mecca the archangel Gabriel standing upon the horizon and filling the sky, and instructing him to recite and thus slowly to create the book known as the Recitation, Al-Quran. This passed from the father to the son. The belief that the story of the birth of Islam was fascinating because it was an event inside history, and that as such, it was obviously influenced by the events and pressures and ideas of the time of its creation. That to historicize the story, to try and understand how a great idea was shaped by those forces, was the only possible approach to the subject, and that one could accept Muhammad as a genuine mystic, just as one could accept Joan of Arc's voices as having genuinely been heard by her, or the revelation of St. John the Divine as being that troubled soul's real experiences, without needing also to accept that had one been standing next to the Prophet of Islam on Mount Hira that day, one would have also have seen the archangel. Revelation was to be understood as an interior subjective event, not an objective reality, and a revealed text was to be scrutinized like any other text, using all the tools of the critic: literary, historical, psychological, linguistic, and sociological. In short, the text was to be regarded as a human artifact, and thus, like all such artifacts, prey to human fallibility and imperfection. Well, that's what I learned from my father, more or less, and then I went to Cambridge and studied the origin story of Islam. And while doing that, I came across this incident, which was known as the incident of the satanic verses. And this is the story of that. They were nomads who had just begun to settle down. Their cities were new. Mecca was only a few generations old. Yathrib, later renamed Medina, was a group of encampments around an oasis without so much as a serious city wall. They were still uneasy in their new urbanized lives, and the changes made many of them unhappy. A nomadic society was conservative, full of rules, valuing the well-being of the group more highly than individual liberty, but it was also inclusive. The nomadic world had been a matriarchy. Under the umbrella of its extended families, even orphaned children could find protection and a sense of identity and belonging. All that was changing now. The city was a patriarchy, and its preferred family unit was nuclear. The crowd of the disenfranchised grew larger and more restive every day. But Mecca was prosperous, and its ruling elders liked it that way. Inheritance now followed the male line. This, too, the governing families preferred. At the gates to the city stood temples to three goddesses, Al-Lat, Al-Manat, and Al-Uzza, winged goddesses like exalted birds, or angels. Each time the trading caravans from which the city gained its wealth left the city gates or came back through them, they paused at one of the temples and made an offering. Or to use modern language, they paid a tax. The wealthiest families in Mecca controlled the temples, and much of their wealth came from these offerings. The winged goddesses were at the heart of the economy of the new city, of the urban civilization that was coming into being. In the building known as the Cube, or Kaaba, in the center of town, there were idols of hundreds of gods. One of these statues, by no means the most popular, represented a deity called Allah, meaning the god, just as Allat was the goddess. Allah was unusual in that he didn't specialize. He wasn't a rain god or a wealth god or a war god or a love god. He was just vaguely an everything god. It may be that this failure to specialize explained his relative unpopularity. People making offerings to gods usually did so for specific reasons: the health of a child, the future of a business enterprise, a drought, a quarrel, a romance. They preferred gods who were experts in their field to this non-specific all-rounder of a deity. However, Allah was about to become more popular than any pagan deity had ever been. The man who would pluck Allah from near obscurity and become his prophet, transforming him into the equal or at least equivalent of the Old Testament God I Am and the New Testament's 3-in-1, was Muhammad ibn Abdullah of the Banu Hashim family, which had fallen in his childhood upon hard times, an orphan living in his uncle's home. As a teenager, he began to journey with that uncle Abu Talib on his trading journeys to Syria. On those journeys, he almost certainly encountered his first Christians, adherents of the Nestorian sect, and heard their stories, many of which adapted Old and New Testament stories to fit in with local conditions. According to the Nestorians, for example, Jesus Christ was born in an oasis under a palm tree. Later, in the Quran, the Archangel Gabriel revealed to Muhammad the surah known as Maryam, Mary, in which Jesus is born under a palm tree in an oasis. Muhammad ibn Abdullah grew up with a reputation as a skilled merchant and honest man, and at the age of 25, this brought him a marriage proposal from an older, wealthier woman, Khadija, and in the next 15 years, he was successful in business and happy in his marriage. However, he was clearly a man with a need for solitude, and for many years he would spend weeks at a time living like a hermit in a cave on Mount Hira. When he was 40 years old, the angel Gabriel disturbed his solitude there and ordered him to recite. Naturally, he immediately believed he had lost his mind and fled. He only returned to hear what the angel had to say when his wife and close friends persuaded him that it might be worth a return trip up the mountain just in case, that it was probably a good idea to check if God was really trying to get in touch. It was easy to admire much of what followed, as the merchant transformed himself into the messenger of God. Easy to sympathize with his persecution and eventual flight to Medina, and to respect his rapid evolution at the Oasis community into respected lawgiver, able ruler, and skilled military leader. It was also easy to see how the world into which the Quran was revealed and the events in the life of the messenger directly influenced the revelation. When Muslim men were killed in battle, the angel was prompt to encourage their brothers to marry their widows in order that the bereaved women might not be lost to the faith by remarrying outside it. When the Prophet's beloved wife Aisha was rumored to have behaved inappropriately while lost in the desert with a certain Safwan ibn Marwan, the angel of the Lord came down in some haste to point out that no, in God's opinion, the virtuous lady had not fooled around. And more generally, it was evident that the ethos of the Quran, the value system it endorsed, was in essence the vanishing code of nomadic Arabs, the matriarchal, more caring society that did not leave orphans out in the cold. Orphans like, for example, Muhammad himself, whose success as a merchant, he believed, entitled him to a place on the city's ruling body, and who had been denied such preferment because he didn't have a powerful family to fight for him. Here was a fascinating paradox, that an essentially conservative theology, looking backwards with affection towards a vanishing culture, became a revolutionary idea because the people whom it attracted most strongly were those who had been marginalized by urbanization, the disaffected poor, the street mob. This perhaps was why Islam, the new idea, felt so threatening to the Meccan elite, why it was persecuted so viciously, and why its founder just may have been offered an attractive deal designed to buy him off. The historical record was incomplete, but most of the major collections of hadiths or traditions about the life of the Prophet, those compiled by Ibn Ishaq, Waqidi, Ibn Sa'd, Bukhari, and Tabari, told the story of an incident that afterwards became known as the incident of the satanic verses. The Prophet came down from the mountain one day and recited the surah number 53 called An-Najm, the star. It contained these words: "Have you heard of Allat and Al-Manat, and Al-Uzza, the third, the other one? They are the exalted birds, and their intercession is greatly to be desired." At a later point, was it days later, or weeks, or months, he returned to the mountain and came down abashed to state that he had been deceived on his previous visit. The devil had appeared to him in the guise of the archangel, and the verses he had been given were therefore not divine, but satanic, and should be expunged from the Quran at once. The angel had on this occasion brought new verses from God, which were to replace the satanic verses in the great book. "Have you heard of Allat and Al-Uzza and Al-Manat, the third, the other one? They are but names that your forefathers invented, and there is no truth in them. Shall God have daughters while you have sons? That would be an unjust division." And in this way, the recitation was purified of the devil's work. But the questions remained. Why did Muhammad initially accept the first false revelation as true? And what happened in Mecca in the period between the two revelations, satanic and angelic? This much was known. Muhammad wanted to be accepted by the people of Mecca. He longed, Ibn Ishaq wrote, for a way to attract them. And when the people heard that he had accepted the three-winged goddesses, the news was popular. They were delighted and greatly pleased at the way in which he spoke of their gods, Ibn Ishaq wrote, saying, "Muhammad has spoken of our gods in splendid fashion." And Bukhari reported, the Prophet prostrated while reciting An-Najm, and with him prostrated the Muslims, the pagans, the jinns, and all human beings. Why then did the Prophet afterwards recant? Western historians, the scholar of Islam, W. Montgomery Watt, the French Marxist Maxime Rodinson, proposed a politically motivated reading of the episode. The temples of the three-winged goddesses were economically important to the city's ruling elite, an elite from which Muhammad was excluded unfairly in his opinion. So perhaps the deal that was offered ran something like this. If Muhammad or the Archangel Gabriel or Allah could agree that the bird goddesses could be worshipped by followers of Islam, not as the equals of Allah, obviously, but as secondary, lesser beings, like, for example, angels. And there already were angels in Islam. So what harm could there be in adding three more, who just happened already to be popular and lucrative figures in Mecca? Then the persecution of Muslims would cease, and Muhammad himself would be granted a seat on the city's ruling council. And it was perhaps to this temptation that the Prophet briefly succumbed. Then what happened? Did the city's grandees renege on the deal, reckoning that by flirting with polytheism, Muhammad had undone himself in the eyes of his followers? Did the followers refuse to accept the revelation of the goddesses? Did Muhammad himself regret having compromised his ideas by yielding to the siren call of acceptability? It was not possible to say for sure. Imagination had to fill in the gaps in the record. But the Quran spoke of how all the prophets had been tested by temptation. "Never have we sent a single prophet or apostle before you with whose wishes Satan did not tamper," it said in Surah 22. And if the incident of the satanic verses was the temptation of Muhammad, it had to be said that he came out of it pretty well. He both confessed to having been tempted and also repudiated the temptation. Tabari quotes him thus, "I have fabricated things against God and have imputed to him words which he has not spoken." After that, the monotheism of Islam, having been tested in the cauldron, remained unwavering and strong, in spite of persecution, exile, and war. And before long, the prophet had the victory over his enemies, and the new faith spread like a conquering fire across the world. Shall God have daughters while you have sons? That would be an unjust division. The true verses, angelic or divine, were clear. It was the femaleness of the winged goddesses, the exalted birds, that rendered them inferior and fraudulent and proved they could not be the children of God as the angels were. Sometimes the birth of a great idea revealed things about its future. The way in which newness enters the world prophesied how it would behave when it grew old. At the birth of this particular idea, femaleness was seen as a disqualification from exaltation. Good story, he thought, when he read about it. Even then, he was dreaming of being a writer, and he filed the good story away in the back of his mind for future consideration. 20 years later, he would find out exactly how good a story it was. Well, that's a bit for the book, but since James entertained you by telling you funny stories, I thought I'd try myself. Because one of the things we used to say to each other in those days about this whole episode was that if it weren't for the fact that it wasn't funny at all, it would be quite funny. And a part of this had to do with learning the particular brand of humor practiced by the police force. For instance, very soon after it began, I was being introduced to all these people who were, special branch protection officers and also special branch drivers who were very highly trained in all kinds of specialist driving techniques. And I noticed that the protection officers referred to the drivers by the term OFD. They'd say, oh, he's an OFD. And eventually I persuaded one of the drivers to tell me what this stood for. And he said, it stands for only fucking drivers. So this was the comic environment in which I found myself. One of the drivers was known to all his colleagues as the King of Spain. And they took a long time to tell me what that was about, but eventually told me that he had once been driving, a police Jaguar and had parked it and left it unlocked while he went into a store to buy a packet of cigarettes. And when he came out, the police Jaguar had been stolen. And because of this, he was called the King of Spain. And to understand that, you have to say the name of the King of Spain slowly. The name of the King of Spain is Juan Carlos. And I've always remembered as a kind of really extraordinary episode the moment when I was first able to come to New York City, come to America. After this began, I was able to come here to speak at Columbia, who was celebrating an anniversary of the Bill of Rights. And the NYPD got very, very overexcited about my presence. And they met me at the airport with I think it was an 11-vehicle motorcade. And the central vehicle was a white armored stretch limo, right? And it felt like being in a Monty Python sketch, with an enormous hand in the sky, going like that. And I remember saying that the head of the detail was a police officer who in the book I call him Lieutenant Bob, so let's call him that. Anyway, I said, Lieutenant Bob, this is a lot. I said, wouldn't it be better to put me in a second-hand Buick and drive me through the back streets of Queens, He looked at me pityingly, and he said, no, sir, that would not be better. And I said, well, who else would you do this for? This kind of thing, who else would you do this for? And he said, sir, it's what we do for Yasser Arafat. So at that point, I discovered what it was like to be the leader of the PLO in New York City. And And so just to push it a bit, I said, well, supposing it was the president, supposing you were protecting the president, what more than this could you possibly do? And he said, well, sir, if you were the president of these United States, sir, we'd close down a lot of these side roads here, sir, and we'd have men on the rooftops there, sir. We'd have motorcycles, probably have a helicopter, sir, but in your case, we thought that would look too conspicuous. So that was how I entered New York City in this 11-vehicle motorcade, going down 125th Street towards Columbia, with the whole of Harlem on the street going, who is that? And my agent, Andrew Wiley, in the car beside me saying, this is the greatest moment of my life. And wasn't of mine. And Lieutenant Bob also had a further problem. He had a problem with my then girlfriend, afterwards my wife Elizabeth, who he decided was menacing. And I mean, if you knew Elizabeth, she's like the least menacing individual in the human race. But they treated her as a potential assassin. And I said to Lieutenant Bob, I said, Lieutenant Bob, Elizabeth's cool. Elizabeth's with me, and he said, if I wanted to kill you, she's exactly who I'd send. And then he said, sir, she could have a fork in her pocketbook, and she could stick that fork in your neck, sir, and I would lose my job. So this was reality in those years. And just as a final sort of moment of ridiculous comedy, I mean, it's all in here, but I may as well tell you. The closest I actually ever came to being killed in these years was not by Islamic terrorists. I was actually in Australia. In 1995, my novel, The Moor's Last Sigh, was published. And with enormous, I won't bore you with sort of extraordinary complication, I was able to arrange a bit of a world tour, book tour, in the middle of this nonsense. And part of that was in Australia. So I found myself in Australia giving talks about the book, and then I persuaded the Australian police that everybody would think I'd left and gone back to England, and instead my Australian writer friend of mine had suggested to me he had a country house on the beach in the sort of bottom right-hand corner of Australia, and he said, why don't you come and have Christmas in the sunshine, and nobody will know you're here, you just come and spend a few days. And so we agreed that was possible. The police allowed me to do that. So we rented a car, and along with Elizabeth and my then teenage son, Zafar, we got into this car and we were driving south from Sydney, and we passed through a town with the poetic name of Milton, New South Wales, as you will see, sort of appropriately named after a blind man. Because what happened in this town is that we were hit by an enormous truck and pushed off the road and slammed into a tree. And this is an accident which most of the time would have killed people, but we kind of miraculously, all three of us, were able to walk away from it without even a broken bone. In fact, my son Zafar slept through it all and woke up after we sort of smashed into this tree and written off the car. He woke up from the back seat and he said, did something happen? And I said, yeah, Zafar, you see that tree in the middle of the car? That's what happened. He said, oh. Anyway, we got out alive and very grateful to be alive. And then two things happened. First, this ambulance arrived, because as it happened, Milton, New South Wales, had a little hospital, which we were very lucky about that. So the ambulance arrived really quickly. And the ambulance, and I'm sitting on the sort of grassy verge of the road, feeling a bit, beaten up because I'd just been in an accident. And the ambulance driver comes up to me and he looks at me and he says, are you Salman Rushdie, mate? And I thought, I really don't want to be. I just want to be somebody who's just been in a car accident, and could you please help? And he said, maybe inappropriate, sir, but could I have an autograph? And I thought, give the man an autograph because he's got the ambulance. And then the police arrived, and they went and started interrogating the poor truck driver and accused him of Islamic sympathies. Yeah. He was just some Australian truck driver. He had no idea who he'd hit or anything, but he was being asked if he had any familiarity with Al-Qaeda and things like that. And anyway, so that happened. But then the thing that I discovered is what the truck was carrying, which is that it was a truckload of fertilizer. And it actually mercifully failed to spill its load. But essentially, the closest I came to being killed was being hit by a truckload of shit. Anyway, at this end of the story, it's a great pleasure to be able to tell the funny stories, but I would recommend, if you can possibly avoid being sentenced to death by the Ayatollah Khomeini, that would be a better way to go. Thank you.